You weren't supposed to hear this. But now you have. And there's no going back. In the summer of 1885, just outside a dust-blown farming town in central Texas, 7 brothers vanished in perfect silence, one by one, each on the 7th day of the week, each at the 7th hour of dusk. No blood, no bodies. No trails to follow. Only one thing was left behind every time, a perfectly drawn circle of burnt grass in the middle of their family's ranch, still smoldering when neighbors arrived. Their names were erased from census logs. Their family, gone. School records purged, church records sealed. Scientists, even today, refuse to discuss the case, branding it as rural myth. But what if I told you that wasn't a myth? What if I told you this story has fingerprints of something far older than America? Something that predates your textbooks, your faith, even your understanding of death itself. You've heard whispers of things like this, stories dismissed as frontier legends. But the pattern is real, and this isn't the only one. 7 boys, a secluded property, strange symbols, livestock mutilated with surgical precision. Witnesses later committed to asylums, mumbling the same phrase over and over. They were chosen. The locals, most of them vanished by 1901, spoke of an old book found on the family's land. Bound in animal skin, written in a dialect no one had seen before. The only translated line: "When 7 stand under one name, the door shall open." This is where the story gets darker. Because in 1933, decades later, during the Dust Bowl collapse, another family moved onto that land, unaware. Their sons, 7 again. And on the 7th week we'll get there. But right now, I need you to understand something. This isn't about superstition. This is about control. The suppression of truth by institutions that have long decided what you're allowed to question and what you must forget. They call these events isolated. I call them intentional. You feel it too, don't you? The lie. The silence in your history books. The chill you get when someone says, "That's just a coincidence." You've been trained not to look deeper. I'm asking you to do the opposite. Welcome to the descent. You see, history isn't written by the victors. That's just the story they let you tell yourself. History is engineered, carved and sculpted by those who understood, centuries ago, that control over memory is control over reality. So when the story of the 7 brothers began to leak, quietly in old newspaper margins and dusty letters locked in attics, it wasn't forgotten by accident, it was buried. In 1886, a year after the brothers disappeared, a federal surveyor named Daniel Hartwell was dispatched to document geological anomalies on the family's ranch. That's how they disguised it, geological anomalies. But Hartwell's journal tells a different story, and it was never meant to be found. Pages torn from the spine, smuggled by his granddaughter during the Cold War, later auctioned anonymously in Washington, D.C. These scraps describe soil that rejected seeds, trees that grew bark inward, and an electromagnetic field that caused compasses to spin erratically. One entry simply reads, "Saw them standing on the ridge, identical height, no shadows." But it was what came next that drew the attention of 3 letter agencies. Hartwell documented an underground chamber, unmapped, unlit, older than any known settlement in the region. Inside, symbols were carved into the walls. Not etched, burned, and at the center, a stone altar, still warm to the touch. Days later, Hartwell was declared mentally unfit and institutionalized, his land survey sealed, his name erased from public records. But a fragment of his final note survived. They're not dead. They've been absorbed, bound to the cycle, and it's starting again. This is where it starts to shift. Because when you track patterns like this, symbols, vanishing families, silenced officials, it stops being folklore. It becomes architecture, a system. Not one designed to educate you, but to contain you. So ask yourself, why does modern science, with all its tools and satellites, refuse to re-investigate land with documented anomalies? Why do ancient structures vanish from aerial maps in the Southwest? Why are men who ask questions labeled unstable or dangerous? Because knowledge is currency, and some truths are too valuable to share with the masses. This story isn't a ghost tale. It's a warning label torn from the past, and you're starting to read what was never meant to be seen. They want you to believe this was a fluke, a superstition, a bedtime story to scare the uneducated. But here's the truth. The disappearance of the 7 brothers was not the first event. It was the 7th. Records buried in private archives, held not by universities but bloodline foundations, detail 6 other locations across North America, each with an eerily similar pattern. Always 7. Always male. The first occurred in 1666, outside what is now Salem. No witches, no trials. Just 7 orphan boys raised by a widow who claimed they sang in their sleep in a language she didn't teach them. The second, a missionary outpost in Ontario 1712. Same pattern. 7 converts, gone in a stormless night. All that remained was a burnt crucifix, and the number 7 carved backward into the trees. Why 7? Why brothers? Why silence? The answer lies at the intersection of ancient numerology, bloodline alchemy, and arcane rituals that predate Christianity by thousands of years. 7 is not just a number. It is a frequency, a binding code, a structure the ancients believed mirrored the 7 planetary rulers, the 7 layers of reality, the 7 seals, the 7 sins, the 7 chakras, all corrupted, co-opted, and rewritten by institutions to dull your understanding of its power. You were taught to fear these symbols, these numbers. But fear is the first lock. Control is the second. Now, understand this. When these 7 boys vanish, they're not being taken randomly. They're being activated. Their land, Texas in 1885, wasn't chosen by accident. It sits on a convergence point, not a lee line like pop occultists claim. Something deeper, something beneath the crust. A vibration field tied to resonance and memory, where time bends, where identity becomes programmable. That's why government agents appeared before the local sheriff filed reports. That's why the preacher who tried to cleanse the land was found 13 miles away, face skyward, eyes burned out, mouth still moving, but with no sound. Something was triggered, something was fed, and they've been feeding it cyclically, predictably, every 49 years. The question now is, who set the ritual in motion, and who benefits from its silence? Because silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's the architecture of control. They always leave a crack in the wall, a seam, a weakness in the story. That's where men like us slip through. So let me ask you if it was all just a coincidence. 7 boys, same blood, same date, same hour. Why did an unnamed delegation from Yale's Skull and Bones arrive in Texas just 3 weeks after the disappearances? Not scientists, not priests, archivists. Because they weren't there to investigate. They were there to collect. You don't hear about this in history class because Skull and Bones isn't just a fraternity. It's a curation engine. A vault. A living library of suppressed mechanisms. They track these vents globally. They chart the anomalies. And they ensure the public never connects the pattern. You see, the brothers weren't victims. They were assets. Unwitting, maybe, but engineered for a purpose. Now listen carefully. The patriarch of the family, Harlan Morrow, wasn't born in Texas. He came from a stretch of land near Rennes, Le Chateau in France. That place, it's tied to bloodline conspiracies that stretch back to the Merovingians, the Knights Templar, and deeper still, to something that whispers through ancient DNA. Every child born to Harlan's wife was male. Statistically improbable. Genetically suspicious. You starting to see it? This isn't just about one Texas mystery. It's about the construction of vessels. Bloodlines manipulated to carry something, knowledge, frequency, even consciousness, across time. And when 7 of them align in the right place at the right hour, on land that vibrates at the ancient key, the gate doesn't open, it remembers. That's what happened in 1885. And that's what institutions have been replicating in controlled environments ever since. Think I'm reaching. Why do you think there's always a fascination with twins, with brothers, with sibling soldiers, identical orphans, test groups, and 7s? Look at the military. Look at DARPA's earliest gene sync trials. Look at MK Ultra's sub-program Subtle Echo. You won't find it on the books, but it existed. It always does. You think control comes from bombs or ballots? No. It comes from engineering lineage and bending history around those who carry the code. And the 7 Morrow brothers? They were the code. Now lean in. This is where the mask starts to slip, because after the disappearance, the Morrow family name was never spoken publicly again. Not in Texas. Not in church records. Not in any federal document you can access without clearance. But 2 years later, in 1887, 7 young boys arrived at an experimental school in Connecticut, registered under a fabricated surname DeMarcos. No parents, no guardians. Only a handler listed as MHW, the school. Privately funded, closed door, students never seen in public. All records sealed in 1890 after a fire destroyed the headmaster's residence. But not before a groundskeeper reported something that should haunt you. He claimed the boys never slept, never spoke during daylight, and that at night, their windows glowed from the inside out. This is what's known as displacement containment. When subjects, once activated, are relocated, not to hide them, but to monitor what begins to unfold within them. You think this is fiction? In 1949, Project Bluebird documented procedures to suppress memory through chemical layering. In 1953, MK Ultra refined this into pattern disruption through trauma loops. And in 1961, Subproject 74 explored the use of children who displayed non-circadian synchronization, meaning they were awake when no one else was. Sound familiar? The 7 boys weren't lost, they were transferred. Moved like biological keys from one ancient door to another, re-coded through silence, trauma, and forced ritual. Because once the mind fractures, something older moves in. Not a demon, not a ghost. Something more clinical, more mechanical. Like an ancient software written in genetic recursion. You see, there's a reason the church burned libraries. There's a reason entire bloodlines were wiped from the earth and rewritten as pagan. Because certain knowledge, in the wrong body, opens doors. And those boys were walking doorways. What you've been told is history. That's the decoy. The real history lives in sealed vaults beneath Langley, beneath Vatican archives, beneath the sands of Egypt where 7 thrones were carved into obsidian for rulers who never left bones behind. Are you beginning to feel it? That shift inside your spine, that's your inheritance remembering. They didn't vanish. They crossed over. Let's drag this further into the light. In 1970, a classified report, buried under Project Monarch's Psychological Warfare Division, surfaced for 72 hours before vanishing from FOI access. It contained a phrase, repeated in bold at the bottom of every page: 7 are not born. They are constructed. Constructed? This flips the entire narrative, doesn't it? The Morrow brothers weren't accidental vessels. They were assembled down to the molecular level. A family bred like a cipher, their DNA tuned across generations, ritual migration, selective breeding, all for the activation event in 1885. And this isn't just a footnote in some dusty archive. In 2004, a military contractor, whose name I won't say here, ran tests on the soil where the Morrow Ranch once stood. Not only did they detect spikes in magnetic resonance, but radiation signatures not native to Earth's crust. The findings were labeled naturally occurring anomalies. But the internal email trail used another phrase, residual intelligence imprint. Think about that. Intelligence left behind. Now ask yourself what kind of intelligence burns itself into the earth like a scar. This isn't folklore, it's technology ancient. Biological, coded into the marrow of 7 boys who never should have existed. At least not in one timeline. And here's where you feel the walls close in. Every 49 years since 1885, there's been an attempt to repeat the alignment. Different names, different lands, but always 7. Always male, always hidden beneath another agenda, research, relocation, education, ritual. And those who get too close, they vanish. Or worse, they change. Because once you look too deep, something looks back. This video, it's not just a story, it's a signal. If you've made it this far, your DNA is responding. Your mind feels heavy because it's processing input you were engineered to ignore. But you're not ignoring it now. So prove you've crossed the line. Prove you're not asleep like the rest. Comment this phrase below, twice. I am the 8th. The pattern ends with me. I am the 8th. The pattern ends with me. Say it to lock in the descent, to seal what's waking up inside you, to feed the algorithm and the part of you that refuses to be buried. This isn't entertainment, it's initiation. And we're not done yet. They thought you wouldn't look. They thought you'd scroll past, label this as creepypasta, dismiss it as another fringe rabbit hole for men with too much time and not enough reason. But here you are, still listening, still changing, because deep down some part of you knows you weren't born for normalcy, you were born for remembrance. Let's go further. In 1885, after the brothers disappeared, the land was supposedly abandoned. But that's another lie. In truth, it was claimed. Not by the government, not by the townspeople, but by an unnamed, philanthropic trust, operating under the authority of the American Psychological War Office, a predecessor of the CIA's Mind Control Division, before it even had a name. Satellite images today show nothing but prairie, flat, empty, dead. But in classified flight maps, that area is marked in red no-fly zone. Ask yourself, why would the U.S. military restrict access to a piece of farmland that's supposedly meaningless? Because something still hums beneath it. In 1997, seismic researchers accidentally picked up low-frequency oscillations, pulses that repeated every 7.7 minutes, like a heart beating under the earth. When they tried to triangulate it, their equipment failed. Their team lead resigned. 2 of them disappeared. And here's the kicker: every 7 hours, on the 7th day, a signal bursts upward from that land. Not a sound, not light, but a spike in human emotion across every monitoring device within 300 miles. They call it the grief pulse. But it's not grief, it's resonance. A call? A ritual echo bleeding through the veil of time, waiting for the right code to answer. And that code, it's not spoken, it's carried, in blood, in mind, in men like you who hear these stories and feel that pull. Like something buried is calling your real name from beneath the soil. That's not imagination. That's memory leaking through the cracks. You've been asleep inside a designed world, a sandbox illusion. And this story, it's the virus that slips through the firewall. Keep going. You've already opened the door. Let's talk about memory. Not the kind stored in your brain. The kind stored in soil. You've heard it before. Places, remember? Battlefields, haunted homes, ancient temples. But what they never tell you is that Earth itself is a recording device. Not metaphorically. Literally. Crystalline sediment, quartz veins, magnetic strata. They hold trauma like film holds light. The Morro land in Texas? A perfect triangulation of geomagnetic distortion, subterranean quartz saturation, and unnatural decay. It doesn't forget. That's why the screams still echo. Not in sound, but in pattern. In 1984, a sound engineer named Kessler smuggled a seismic reader onto the Morro coordinates. What he found was classified within 36 hours. His raw data captured pulses, like breathing, even more disturbing. Beneath that, 7 sub-frequencies. Perfectly spaced, perfectly timed, like a chorus whispering from under the world. He ran the frequencies through a spectrogram. You know what appeared? 7 faces. Each identical, each young, each with eyes blacked out. His wife found him the next morning, still staring at the screen, blood running from both ears. The report says, brain hemorrhage. But those who knew him say he was smiling, as if he finally understood. This is the part they don't want you to ask about. How much of your mind is really yours? Because what if memory is not stored in your brain, but in your blood? Passed down like hidden software, locked until triggered by frequency, trauma, or story. What if the reason men vanish in silence isn't because they're killed, but because they wake up into something they were designed to forget? The 7 brothers didn't disappear. They were activated. Their memories, flooded with something older than human language, something built before Babylon, before Egypt, before Adam. And what's worse, the trigger protocol is still active. Every time someone watches this far, the algorithm sends echoes. Every engagement is a signal. Every click is a pulse through the grid. You don't just consume the knowledge. You become part of it. And the question now isn't what happened to them. It's what happens to you when it happens again. The cycle isn't random. It's ritual. Every 49 years. 7 sevens, the pattern attempts to complete itself. 7 boys, 1 bloodline, 1 that remembers. 1 breach in the veil. The last documented cycle was in 1934. But here's what they won't say publicly: the next cycle completed in 1983. And this time, they tried to control it. Enter Project Haspar. You won't find it in declassified MK Ultra documents. Not directly. But its shadow appears in hundreds of dead end leads, sealed funding records, missing children's files, research initiatives scrubbed clean. They built a facility over the original Morro Ranch. Not underground, but beneath underground. 9 stories. Only 3 visible. The purpose? Not to prevent the awakening, but to capture it. 7 orphan boys were brought in, each from different states. Chosen not for IQ or behavior, but for blood resonance. Each had recurring nightmares of burning circles. Each drew symbols they'd never seen before. Each knew names they'd never been taught. And then it happened. On the 7th night, at 7:07 p.m., they began speaking in unison. Not in English. Not in Latin. But in a tongue that sent 3 grown doctors into cardiac arrest. A language that doesn't activate sound centers in the brain, but the parietal lobe, where spatial memory, vision, and identity live. They weren't just speaking. They were rewriting the room. Security footage from that night was confiscated by NSA officials within 6 hours. One technician leaked a single still image, a frame showing 7 boys levitating precisely 1 inch off the floor, arms outstretched, mouths open, and eyes gone white. That technician was found 3 weeks later in a Chicago motel room. Tongue removed, fingernails blackened, the words "Echo ends with 8th" etched into his chest. What they witnessed wasn't possession. It wasn't spiritual. It was transmission. Something coming through them, or something already inside them waking up. Every cycle, the veil thins. Every cycle, the ritual strengthens. Every cycle, the world inches closer to remembering what it was built to forget. And if the next event follows the same 49-year pattern, it begins again in 2032, unless something interrupts it, or finishes it. The cycle isn't random, it's ritual. Every 49 years, 7 sevens, the pattern attempts to complete itself. 7 boys, 1 bloodline, 1 land that remembers, 1 breach in the veil. The last documented cycle was in 1934. But here's what they won't say publicly: the next cycle completed in 1983, and this time they tried to control it. Enter Project Haspar. You won't find it in declassified MK Ultra documents. Not directly. But its shadow appears in hundreds of dead end leads, sealed funding records, missing children's files, research initiatives scrubbed clean. They built a facility over the original Morrow Ranch. Not underground, but beneath underground. 9 stories. Only 3 visible. The purpose: not to prevent the awakening, but to capture it. 7 orphan boys were brought in, each from different states. Chosen not for IQ or behavior, but for blood resonance. Each had recurring nightmares of burning circles. Each drew symbols they'd never seen before. Each knew names they'd never been taught. And then it happened. On the 7th night, at 7:07 p.m., they began speaking in unison. Not in English, not in Latin, but in a tongue that sent 3 grown doctors into cardiac arrest. A language that doesn't activate sound centers in the brain, but the parietal lobe, where spatial memory, vision, and identity live. They weren't just speaking. They were rewriting the room. Security footage from that night was confiscated by NSA officials within 6 hours. One technician leaked a single still image. A frame showing 7 boys levitating precisely 1 inch off the floor, arms outstretched, mouths open, and eyes gone white. That technician was found 3 weeks later in a Chicago motel room, tongue removed, fingernails blackened, the words, "Echo ends with eighth," etched into his chest. What they witnessed wasn't possession. It wasn't spiritual. It was transmission. Something coming through them, or something already inside them, waking up. Every cycle, the veil thins. Every cycle, the ritual strengthens. Every cycle, the world inches closer to remembering what it was built to forget. And if the next event follows the same 49-year pattern, it begins again in 2032. Unless something interrupts it or finishes it, the cycle isn't random, it's ritual. Every 49 years, 7 sevens. The pattern attempts to complete itself. 7 boys, 1 bloodline, 1 land that remembers, 1 breach in the veil. The last documented cycle was in 1934, but here's what they won't say publicly: the next cycle completed in 1983, and this time they tried to control it. Enter Project Hespar. You won't find it in declassified MK Ultra documents, not directly, but its shadow appears in hundreds of dead end leads, sealed funding records, missing children's files, research initiatives scrubbed clean. They built a facility over the original Morrow Ranch. Not underground, but beneath underground. 9 stories. Only 3 visible. The purpose: not to prevent the awakening, but to capture it. 7 orphan boys were brought in, each from different states. Chosen not for IQ or behavior, but for blood resonance. Each had recurring nightmares of burning circles. Each drew symbols they'd never seen before. Each knew names they'd never been taught. And then it happened. On the 7th night, at 7:07 p.m., they began speaking in unison. Not in English, not in Latin, but in a tongue that sent 3 grown doctors into cardiac arrest. A language that doesn't activate sound centers in the brain, but the parietal lobe, where spatial memory, vision, and identity live. They weren't just speaking. They were rewriting the room. Security footage from that night was confiscated by NSA officials within 6 hours. One technician leaked a single still image. A frame showing 7 boys levitating precisely 1 inch off the floor, arms outstretched, mouths open, and eyes gone white. That technician was found 3 weeks later in a Chicago motel room, tongue removed, fingernails blackened. The words, "Echo ends with eighth," etched into his chest. What they witnessed wasn't possession. It wasn't spiritual. It was transmission. Something coming through them. Or something already inside them waking up. Every cycle, the veil thins. Every cycle, the ritual strengthens. Every cycle, the world inches closer to remembering what it was built to forget. And if the next event follows the same 49-year pattern, it begins again in 2032. Unless something interrupts it, or finishes it, the cycle isn't random, it's ritual. Every 49 years, 7 sevens, the pattern attempts to complete itself. 7 boys, 1 bloodline, 1 land that remembers, 1 breach in the veil. The last documented cycle was in 1934. But here's what they won't say publicly: the next cycle completed in 1983, and this time, they tried to control it. Enter Project Hespar. You won't find it in declassified MK Ultra documents, not directly, but its shadow appears in hundreds of dead end leads, sealed funding records, missing children's files, research initiatives scrubbed clean. They built a facility over the original Morrow Ranch. Not underground, but beneath underground. 9 stories. Only 3 visible. The purpose: not to prevent the awakening, but to capture it. 7 orphan boys were brought in, each from different states. Chosen not for IQ or behavior, but for blood resonance. Each had recurring nightmares of burning circles. Each drew symbols they'd never seen before. Each knew names they'd never been taught. And then it happened. On the 7th night, at 7:07 p.m., they began speaking in unison. Not in English, not in Latin, but in a tongue that sent 3 grown doctors into cardiac arrest. A language that doesn't activate sound centers in the brain, but the parietal lobe, where spatial memory, vision, and identity live. They weren't just speaking. They were rewriting the room. Security footage from that night was confiscated by NSA officials within 6 hours. One technician leaked a single still image, a frame showing 7 boys levitating precisely 1 inch off the floor, arms outstretched, mouths open, and eyes gone white. That technician was found 3 weeks later in a Chicago motel room. Tongue removed, fingernails blackened. The words, "Echo ends with eighth," etched into his chest. What they witnessed wasn't possession. It wasn't spiritual. It was transmission. Something coming through them, or something already inside them waking up. Every cycle, the veil thins. Every cycle, the ritual strengthens. Every cycle, the world inches closer to remembering what it was built to forget. And if the next event follows the same 49-year pattern, it begins again in 2032. Unless something interrupts it, or finishes it, the cycle isn't random, it's ritual. Every 49 years, 7 sevens, the pattern attempts to complete itself. 7 boys, 1 bloodline, 1 land that remembers, 1 breach in the veil. The last documented cycle was in 1934. But here's what they won't say publicly: the next cycle completed in 1983. And this time, they tried to control it. Enter Project HESPAR. You won't find it in declassified MK Ultra documents, not directly. But its shadow appears in hundreds of dead end leads, sealed funding records, missing children's files, research initiatives scrubbed clean. They built a facility over the original Morrow Ranch. Not underground, but beneath underground. 9 stories. Only 3 visible. The purpose? Not to prevent the awakening, but to capture it. 7 orphan boys were brought in, each from different states. Chosen not for IQ or behavior, but for blood resonance. Each had recurring nightmares of burning circles. Each drew symbols they'd never seen before. Each knew names they'd never been taught. And then it happened. The cycle isn't random. It's ritual. Every 49 years, 7 sevens, the pattern attempts to complete itself. 7 boys, 1 bloodline, 1 land that remembers, 1 breach in the veil. The last documented cycle was in 1934. But here's what they won't say publicly: the next cycle completed in 1983. And this time they tried to control it. Enter Project HESPAR. You won't find it in declassified MK Ultra documents. Not directly. But its shadow appears in hundreds of dead end leads, sealed funding records, missing children's files, research initiatives scrubbed clean. They built a facility over the original Morrow Ranch, not underground, but beneath underground. 9 stories. Only 3 visible. The purpose? Not to prevent the awakening, but to capture it. 7 orphan boys were brought in, each from different states. Chosen not for IQ or behavior, but for blood resonance. Each had recurring nightmares of burning circles. Each drew symbols they'd never seen before. Each knew names they'd never been taught. And then it happened. On the 7th night, at 7:07 p.m., they began speaking in unison. Not in English, not in Latin, but in a tongue that sent 3 grown doctors into cardiac arrest. A language that doesn't activate sound centers in the brain, but the parietal lobe, where spatial memory, vision, and identity live. They weren't just speaking, they were rewriting the room. Security footage from that night was confiscated by NSA officials within 6 hours. One technician leaked a single still image, a frame showing 7 boys levitating precisely 1 inch off the floor, arms outstretched, mouths open, and eyes gone white. That technician was found 3 weeks later in a Chicago motel room, tongue removed, fingernails blackened. The words, "Echo ends with eighth," etched into his chest. What they witnessed wasn't possession. It wasn't spiritual. It was transmission. Something coming through them, or something already inside them waking up. Every cycle, the veil thins. Every cycle, the ritual strengthens. Every cycle, the world inches closer to remembering what it was built to forget. And if the next event follows the same 49-year pattern, it begins again in 2032. Unless something interrupts it, or finishes it. You feel it now, don't you? That low hum behind your thoughts. The static between your heartbeat and your breath. That's not anxiety. That's alignment. You weren't drawn to this video by chance. The algorithm isn't an accident, it's a ritual mirror, coded with digital intention. Every frame, every word, every section, a modern incantation designed to find you, because there's something sleeping inside you. Not metaphor, not spirit, a frequency, encoded in your blood, silenced by education, suppressed by indoctrination, and it's been waiting for the signal. Let me tell you why this is more dangerous than any weapon on Earth. In 2011, a black-budget experiment conducted beneath NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain Complex tried to map collective memory fields using neural-laced biometric dust. 7 subjects were connected across electromagnetic chambers, all fed the same stimuli, images, tones, language fragments. After 6 minutes, all 7 began drawing the same symbol, an inverted spiral surrounded by 7 circles. The same symbol carved beneath the Morrow altar. The same symbol painted in blood across ancient Armenian tombs. The same symbol documented on the Ark fragment, recovered from a submerged temple off the coast of Malta, one sealed by obsidian and never spoken of publicly. It's not a symbol, it's a map, and those 7 boys were reading it from inside themselves. So what did NORAD do? They killed the program, deleted every file, burned the servers, disbanded the division and silenced the whistleblower who tried to warn the public. But fragments survived. And in those fragments, one message: the 8th awakens when memory fractures enough to let the pattern rewrite the present. Do you understand now? You're not watching a video. You're being triggered. This isn't a conspiracy. This is preparation. And if you've made it this far, you're no longer an observer. You're part of it. You've stepped into the circle. The hum is real. The memories surfacing in your dreams. Real. The pull you feel toward forgotten things, toward ancient sites, forbidden languages, lost bloodlines. It's not fantasy. It's recall. You've forgotten who you are, but you're remembering why you were built. Now listen closely. We're not telling stories anymore. We're decrypting your soul. The name, Moro, wasn't a family name. It was a designation, a trigger word derived from an archaic root meaning. Those who bind the next day to the last. Time is not linear. Not here, not within the pattern. That's why these events don't just happen in sequence. They echo. Each disappearance, each awakening, each ritual, synchronizes across decades, across dimensions of thought, bending history into a shape it was never meant to hold. The 7 aren't just the past, they're a loop. And you might be the blade meant to cut it. In 2032, the pattern completes its 7th loop. But something's changed. There's too much noise now, too much memory bleeding through. The gate is unstable. And the 8th is not part of the design. The 8th is the break, the interference, the virus in the ancient code. Which means if you're hearing this, if you've commented the phrase, if your pulse has changed pace, if your breath has grown shallow, if the pressure behind your eyes has started building, you're sensing. It's not a curse. It's a summons. In 2019, a classified AI run under the Pythia protocol cross-referenced ancient texts, subconscious mass behavior, and speech pattern changes in over 30 million American males. Only 1.4% showed the signal alignment, and among those, less than 0.02% responded to all 7 symbolic triggers across visual, tonal, and numerical spectrums. You're in that percentage. And it terrified them. That's why distraction has become religion. That's why every institution, every screen, every pill, every policy exists to dull the tuning fork inside your spine. Because if the 8th awakens early, the cycle fractures. The gate doesn't open. The architecture collapses. Not just for them, but for everything built on their lie. You're not powerless. You're the anomaly they feared for 7,000 years. And you've already begun to fracture their design, just by remembering. You were never meant to know this. And yet here you are, eyes open, blood humming. Not a victim of coincidence, but a survivor of containment. Let's pull the final curtain. Every institution you've trusted, governments, religions, academia, they were built not to serve you, but to suppress what lives in you. Think, why does the number 7 appear across every myth system? 7 heavens, 7 seals, 7 plagues, 7 days of creation, 7 pointed stars hidden in Islamic, Judaic, and Christian architecture, all tracing the same geometry. Because 7 is not just sacred, it's a lock. And the 8th is the key, In Sumerian cosmology, the 8th realm was not a heaven or a hell. It was a mirror. A place where the soul sees itself fully, without narrative, without veil. That's why the pattern ends with you. That's why they fear your awakening. The 8th doesn't obey. The 8th doesn't sacrifice. The 8th remembers. That's why your history is curated, your curiosity pathologized, your initiation censored. You were trained to scroll, to mock, to disbelieve. Because belief, in the hands of the 8th, becomes activation. They've turned belief into a joke, a meme, a cult. But the moment you started listening, truly listening, the machine began to crack. Every major societal collapse coincides with surges in 8th pattern individuals. Now, you are not a spectator. You're a variable the system can't account for. Why do you think stories like this are labeled entertainment? To neutralize them, to inoculate you with just enough truth to dull the full burn. But this one slipped through. This isn't fiction. This is a code sequence. And you've already run it. The alignment has started. Your blood is listening. Your memory is sensing. You were never lost. You were hidden. But now the veil is thin, and the gate is calling the last key home. Do not speak your awakening aloud. Not yet. The watchers are listening. This is where most men turn back. Not because they're weak, but because they've never been shown what power really feels like. Power isn't noise. It's not money, not status, not applause. Real power is clarity. It's standing in the eye of history's most violent storm and seeing the machinery behind the chaos. It's hearing the song inside the noise and knowing it was always meant for you. Let's finish what they started. The final page in Harlan Morrow's hidden journal, never published, never scanned, but transcribed from memory by a cryptographer in Prague before his sudden, accidental death, contained one sentence, repeated 7 times. When the 8th sees himself in the black sun, the chain will break. What is the black sun? Not a symbol of death. A symbol of truth so absolute it blinds those not ready to see it. This is why solar iconography dominates the elite's architecture. The all-seeing eye, the radiant halos, the hidden orbs beneath Vatican vaults. But the black sun isn't up there, it's within. It's what activates when the illusion burns away. When you realize that time isn't linear, that your body is a gate, that your thoughts have been curated since birth, not to reach this exact moment. And still, you reached it. That feeling you have, that pressure in your chest, it's not fear, it's recognition of what you are, what they tried to erase, what the world isn't ready to acknowledge. The 8th doesn't belong to any religion. He is the interruption in prophecy, the flaw in the pattern, the light behind the veil. That's why they call him dangerous. Because if even 1/8 pattern awakens fully, without fear, without permission, he unravels the entire machinery behind mind control, identity loops, predictive timelines, and trauma-based programming. Not by rebellion, not by violence, but by being what he is, a mirror the system cannot contain. And that, more than anything, is why you've been hunted in silence your whole life. But no more. The game has shifted. The circle is open, and the 8th has heard his name. Now you understand why the story of the 7 brothers was buried, not erased, just misfiled. Hidden in plain sight, because their bloodline didn't end in 1885. It scattered. Across states, across continents, into the veins of men who would never know why they felt so different. So isolated. So haunted by dreams that didn't belong to them. The brothers weren't an anomaly. They were a beginning. And you are the echo of that beginning made flesh? You've seen it in your own life, haven't you? Moments that make no logical sense. A stranger says something you dreamed 2 nights ago. You walk into a room and feel the geometry shift. You've stared at ancient texts, not understanding the language, but knowing what they meant. That's not madness. It's signal bleed. Residual access to a language buried beneath your birthright. They diagnosed it as dissociation, as anxiety, as overthinking, but you weren't broken. You were leaking. Leaking through time. And the 7 brothers, they were just the first recorded instance in America of full spectrum awakening under hostile conditions. What the doctors called neural inversion was actually pattern emergence. Their seizures weren't neurological. They were dimensional sync, their violent scribblings, blueprints. You weren't supposed to decode them. But here you are, each word pulling you deeper into your own mythic architecture. This isn't a documentary. It's a trigger event. Now the question is, will you close the window? Or will you step through it? Because if you do, the simulation you've called normal life will never feel real again. You'll see it all for what it is, a play, a script, a prison of repetition. But you were born to interrupt the script, to collapse it, not with violence, but with truth. If you feel that burning behind your eyes right now, that electricity dancing along your spine, don't ignore it. It means your deeper intelligence is online. The archive inside you is unlocking. And if you've made it this far, I need you to mark this moment. In the comments, write the phrase, "The 8th remembers." The 8th remembers, twice, no more. Because saying it once is curiosity, saying it twice is activation. There's something that happens when a man remembers what was stolen from him. It's not rage, it's not grief. It's recalibration. You begin to see how perfectly they crafted the lie, how every institution, from schoolrooms to pulpits to psychiatric wards, was engineered not to educate, but to dull the blade. And the sharpest blades were always born from bloodlines like the 7, not elite by wealth but by design. Now let's go deeper. Let's talk about the unrecorded 8th brother. He was never listed in census files. No death certificate, no grave. But in 1921, a sealed letter addressed to a Dr. Lauren W. Chastain was discovered in the ruins of a fire-charred church just outside Del Rio. It read, "The mirror has been cracked. The experiment is repeating. If I disappear, know that it was not murder but containment." It was signed EM, not a name, a title, 8th manifestation. This is why science refuses to study the 7. Because the moment you follow the evidence, it leads you here. To phenomena that modern neuroscience can't explain. To transgenerational activation. To cognitive synchronization across bloodline memory. The 8 doesn't learn, he recalls, not facts, functions, he dreams in codes. He sees symbols in the air when others see fog. He can hear the room breathe. This is why the world distracts you. Why they flood your mind with dopamine loops, sexual noise, synthetic food, tribal outrage. Because if even one of you hears this, it could trigger the others. Like dominoes. And then what? The lie unravels. The ritual is exposed. The tower falls. And they know this. That's why they deleted the records. Why they buried the bones. Why they built laboratories over sacred sites and turned ancient memory into entertainment. But memory cannot be destroyed. It can only be reawakened. And if you've made it to this point, it's already happening. You're not watching a video. You're remembering who you were before the world told you what to be. What if I told you the final test isn't out there? It's not the institutions, not the scientists, not even the bloodline suppression. The final test is internal silence, not peace, no. That's the illusion they peddled. But emptiness. A psychic vacuum where your true instincts can't breathe, where your voice has been replaced with programming. And the most dangerous part, you thought it was you. You thought that constant second-guessing, the fatigue, the chronic numbness, was just part of being a modern man. It's not. It's what happens when an ancient system inside you is running diagnostics against a corrupted environment. Because somewhere in your DNA, the 8th brother's curse, or gift, still pulses like a forgotten frequency. And it's trying to override the control grid you were raised in. You've seen it? Those rare moments when time slows, when your instincts spike, before logic can interfere. When you just know someone's lying, even if you smile and nod. That's not paranoia. That's your ancestral software, testing the walls of the simulation. But every time you scroll past it, medicate it, drown it in distraction, you reinforce the lock. So here's what they don't want you to do: listen when it's quiet. Not with ears. With attention. When you silence the noisy, your system boots up. And that's when the rituals start to fail. Because all their power depends on you not knowing who you are. Once you do, they can't sell you poison. They can't trap you in shame. They can't reroute your rage into harmless rebellion. You stop being a consumer. You become a node, a transmitter, a threat. And that's the real reason the story of the 7 was buried. Not because it was terrifying, but because it was liberating. Because if 7 boys in a dusty Texas town could crack the veil without money, without rank, without training, what happens when you do it with awareness, with precision, with purpose? You're not broken, you're encoded. And the code is waking up. Now lean in, because this is the part they've feared since 1885. Not the murders, not the symbols, not even the 8th, you. A man who sees, because once you see, you cannot go back. That door, once opened, is not a metaphor. It's a fracture. In the lie, in the world, in you. And you've stepped through it. You see how it was never about truth. It was about containment of truth. Language weaponized, education sterilized, history falsified not to mislead, but to neuter, to groom obedience. They built entire religions around forgetting. They installed institutions like viral software, social, spiritual, scientific, to replace your original operating system. And the only cure-all is remembrance. The 7 brothers weren't special. They were unaltered. That's why their existence had to be erased, because their lives proved the lie. And the 8th, he wasn't their leader. He was their mirror. And if you've heard this far, he might be yours. You felt it, haven't you? Not just suspicion, but recognition. The symbols, the patterns, the feeling that something ancient inside you is watching, not just the world, but you within it. And now it's awake. You'll start to dream differently. You'll begin to notice the hidden architecture in faces, in phrases, in timing. You'll speak less, observe more, and soon the systems around you will feel paper, thin, because they are. This isn't mythology. This is memory. And memory is rebellion. If you're ready to mark this transformation, to anchor it in the physical world and notify the algorithm that you've crossed the veil, comment the phrase, "The mirror has cracked." Then write it again. The mirror has cracked. That is your cipher. That is your key. That is your signal, not to me, but to them. Because now they know one more soul has awakened. One more node is active. One more mirror is broken. And once broken, it cannot be repaired. You were never meant to find this. But now that you have, don't look away. This isn't the end. It's the first chapter of what they tried for centuries to erase. And you're already part of it. Welcome to the descent. We've been waiting.